"I have 6 months to live," said the Duke of Larkmore, "and I need an heir. You will do." The woman on the other side of the apothecary's counter did not scream, or blush, or drop the scales she was holding. She finished weighing out the powder, tipped it into a twist of paper, folded the corners down neatly, and set it beside the ledger. Then she looked up. "That is 3p," she said, "for the fever powder. The proposal I will take as a separate account." Corwin Ashby, 6th Duke of Larkmore, had been dying for 11 weeks and had not laughed once in any of them. He did not laugh now, but something moved in his chest that he had thought was finished moving. He put down a sovereign. "Keep it. I have not got change for that." "Then keep the change too." "I shall keep the 3p," said Verity Mansell, "and put the rest in the poor box, and you may tell me plainly, your grace, whether you are drunk or mad or mocking me, 'cause I have a great deal to do before dark, and I would rather know which." He set both hands on the counter. Standing was becoming a thing he had to plan. The rain went hard against the little bow window, and the shop smelled of camphor and dried mint, and the sharp green of bruised leaves, and the woman before him was perhaps 27. In a brown stuff gown with her sleeves turned back to the elbow, with ink on one finger and a plain, clean face and grey eyes that did not move from here, he said. "Sir Marcus Trelawney attended me in London a fortnight ago. He is the first physician in England. He says a wasting of the blood and no remedy, and 6 months and perhaps not that. I have no brother, I have no son. If I die without an heir, Larkmore goes to my father's cousin's boy, who is a fool of the first water, and 41 families on this land will be turned off within the year to make room for sheep, and the village you are standing in will be pulled down." Her chin lifted a fraction. She said nothing. "There are women in London who would take the bargain in an hour," he went on. "I do not want them. They would spend the 6 months counting the plate. I have watched you in this village for 4 years, madam. You buried your father, you took his shop, you paid his debts. You sat up 9 nights with the Cardew family in the scarlet fever when the parish would not go near the door. You are not afraid of a dying man." "No," she agreed. "I am not afraid of a dying man." "Then marry me. Tomorrow by license. There is a settlement of £30,000 and the dower house, and if there is a son the land is safe, and you will be the mother of a duke, and no one in England may touch you." He heard his own voice go flat and hard, the way it did in the last hour of every day now. "It is a cold thing to ask. I am aware of it. I am asking anyway." The clock ticked. Somewhere behind the shop a kettle came slowly up to the boil. Verity Mansell wiped her hands on her apron and came round the end of the counter and stood in front of him, and she was a full head shorter than he, and she looked up at him with a steadiness that made him want, absurdly, to sit down. "No," she said. He had been so certain that he had not prepared a second sentence. "No," she said again, gently. "I will not give you a son to be born fatherless, your grace, and grow up in a great cold house being told that his father died before he was weaned, and that he must therefore be a duke by Tuesday. I will not do it to him, and I will not do it to you either. Spend your last 6 months in a bed, waiting on and here, like a man setting a chair straight in a house that is burning down. Then we have nothing to discuss." "We have a great deal to discuss." She reached out. She actually reached out and took his wrist, 2 fingers laid to the pulse of it, and he was so astonished that he let her. "Your hands are cold and your nail beds are blue. How long have you had the night sweats?" "Madam, how long?" "Since March," he said, before he had decided to answer. "And the fever comes in the evening and goes by morning, and you are worst about 6 o'clock, and you have a taste in your mouth like an old penny, and there is a place under your ribs on the right that you do not like to be touched." She let go of his wrist. Her face had changed entirely. "Sit down, your grace, before you fall down. Sit down and tell me about the war." Corwin sat down. It was the first order anyone had given him in 15 years, and he obeyed it like a private soldier. "What has the war to do with anything? You were shot," she said, "at Valamonte. Everybody in this village knows it. They tell it in the Aller House. 7 years ago, where?" He put his hand slowly to the place beneath his ribs on the right. Verity Mansell nodded once, as though a long sum had come out. "Sir Marcus Trelawney," she said, "is the first physician in England, and he has never in his life put his hand on a soldier who was not already dead. My father was a surgeon's mate in the fleet for 19 years, and I have dressed more wounds in this back room than that man has seen in Harley Street." She was already reaching for her shawl, already calling through to the back for the boy to mind the shop. You do not have a wasting of the blood. You have something in you that should have come out 7 years ago and has been quietly poisoning you ever since, and it is going to kill you by Christmas unless somebody cuts it out. He stared at her. You are an apothecary's daughter, he said. Yes. Trelawney is a knight of the realm. Yes, she said, tying her bonnet. And if you would rather die a duke than live and insult your grace, then go home and put your affairs in order, and I shall come to the funeral and be very sorry. But if you would rather live, and here she stopped with her hand on the door and looked back at him, and for the first time her voice was not steady at all. If you would rather live, then let me look at it, and marry me if you like, but not for an heir. Marry me for 6 months of somebody fighting for you instead of sitting in the next room waiting. The rain came off the eaves in a grey sheet. The Duke of Larkmore, who had commanded 400 men at Valamonte and had not been afraid, discovered that he was afraid now, and that what frightened him was not the knife, it was hope. He had put it away carefully in March, like a coat he would not need again, and here was a woman in a brown stuff gown holding it out to him in the doorway of an apothecary's shop and telling him to put it on. Very well, he said. They were married on the Thursday in the small church at Larkmore, before the vicar, the sexton and Corwin's steward, who wept and pretended it was a cold. She came up the aisle in a grey gown with a sprig of rosemary at the breast, because there were no flowers in November, and she put her hand in his, and her hand was warm and his was not, and when the vicar said the words about sickness and health, she said, I will, so firmly that the sexton jumped. There was no wedding breakfast. There was instead a fire built up in the small library at Larkmore Hall, and a great many candles and a scrubbed deal table brought up from the kitchens, and the new Duchess of Larkmore in her wedding gown with her sleeves turned back to the elbow, saying, Take off your coat and your shirt and lie down on the table and let me see. This is not, Corwin said, how I imagined the evening. No, she agreed. Lie down. He lay down. Her fingers went over his ribs, slow and impersonal and sure, and stopped at the place and pressed, and he could not keep the sound behind his teeth. She was quiet a long moment. Well, he said, the ceiling. There is a hardness, she said, the size of a plum, and it is hot, and the skin above it is drawn. And there is an old scar over it, and that scar has healed too well and too fast, which is exactly what a wound does when it is closed over something it should not have been closed over. She straightened. Her face was pale. They dug the ball out of you on a table in a field, in the dark, in a hurry. Yes. And a ball goes in with company, your grace. It carries cloth in with it, a piece of your coat, a piece of your shirt. And if that stays in the flesh will wall it up and make a pocket, and the pocket will fester quietly for years, and it will feed a low fever and a night sweat and a wasting, and a fashionable physician in London will look at a thin grey man and say, a wasting of the blood. Corwin lay on the deal table in his own library and looked up at his wife of 4 hours and heard the rain on the window. How do you know this? He said. Because I have seen it, she said. Twice. My father called it the long splinter. One of them lived. And the other? Verity Mansell, Verity Ashby, now Duchess of Larkmore, put her hand flat over the hot place under his ribs as though she could hold the thing still by main force, and there were tears standing in her eyes and absolutely none in her voice. The other died, she said, because he waited a year too long, and he was afraid of the knife, and his family let him be afraid. You have been dying for 7 years, Corwin, and nobody has told you. I am telling you. Her hand tightened. Now, are you a brave man, or only a duke? The surgeon came from Edinburgh, and his name was Folds, and he had taken more limbs off more men than he cared to count, and he did not bow. He looked at the place under the duke's ribs for a long time, and then he looked at the Duchess of Larkmore, who stood at the end of the table with her sleeves turned back, and he said, Who told you it was cloth, my father? 19 years in the Fleet, and what would your father have done? Opened it, she said, and taken out what was in it, and washed it with spirit, and packed it open with clean lint, and let it heal from the bottom, and not sewed it up over the dirt like a coward. Folds looked at her for a moment longer. Aye, he said. Well, I'll want 3 lamps and a deal of hot water, and somebody who will not faint. She will not faint, said Corwin. You've a great deal of confidence in a woman you married on Thursday. I have a great deal of confidence, said the Duke of Larkmore, in the only person in England who did not look at me and see a corpse. There was no chloroform in that year and in that county. There was brandy, and there was a strap of leather, and there was Verity's hand. She stood at the head of the table where he could see her, and she held his hand in both of hers, and she did not let go, and she did not look away, not when Fords took up the knife, not when the thing was opened, not when the room filled with a smell like a battlefield and the surgeon said, quite calmly, "There it is, and there's a deal of it, hold him now," and Corwin Ashby, who had ridden a horse into the guns at Valemont, went a long way down into the dark, and the last thing he knew of the world was a woman's voice saying, over and over, very steadily, "I am here, I am here. Corwin, I am here." It was 3 inches of the facing of a green coat. Fords washed it in a basin and set it in a saucer on the library table, where it sat all that winter, looking like nothing at all. The fever came on the second night, as Fords had said it would, and it came like the tide. Corwin remembered afterwards only fragments, the ceiling of his own chamber sliding sideways, the terrible cold that no fire could touch, his own voice giving orders to men who had been 7 years dead, the sound of somebody sponging out a basin, and Verity, always Verity. Verity at 2 in the morning with her hair down her back, lifting his head to the cup. Verity arguing with somebody in the corridor in a low, savage voice. "He will have the window open, he will have air, and if you close it again I shall put you out of this house myself." Verity's palm on his forehead. Verity saying, once, when she thought he could not hear, "You are not going to do this to me. You are not going to make me a widow of 9 days. I have not come this far for a headstone. Fight, you obstinate man. Fight." He fought. On the 5th night the fever broke. He came up out of it the way a diver comes up, all at once, into grey daylight and a smell of clean linen, and turned his head. And she was asleep in the chair beside the bed with her mouth a lit open and a bowl of cold water still in her lap, and her hair a disgrace and her hands red to the wrist from washing lint. Corwin lay still for a long time and looked at her. He had spent 11 weeks composing himself for death with what he had privately considered a certain dignity. He understood now, with the peculiar clarity of a man newly returned from somewhere, that it had not been dignity at all. It had been surrender dressed for company, and that a woman he had insulted across a counter had refused, on his behalf, to accept it. "You are staring," she said, without opening her eyes. "Yes. Is the pain worse?" "No." She opened her eyes then, and he watched her see it, the change. The clearness, the fever gone, and he watched her face come apart entirely, and she put her hands over it and bent forward until her forehead was on the counterpane, and the Duke of Larkmore lifted one weak hand and laid it on his wife's bent head and let her cry. Verity. "Do not speak to me," she said, muffled, furious, weeping. 5 nights. 5 nights, and you have said nothing but Sergeant Bell's name and something about the guns, and you would not drink. And at 3 o'clock this morning I could not find your pulse for a count of 4, and I have never in my life," she lifted her ruined face, "I have never in my life been so angry with anyone. I am sorry," he said. "You had better be. Verity, come here." And she came, and he put his arm about her, and they stayed like that a long while in the grey morning, saying nothing, while below them the great house went about the business of a duke who was, against all professional opinion, not dying. He mended slowly, and badly and disgracefully. The wound was packed open and dressed twice a day, and healed from the bottom as she had said it must, and it took 9 weeks, and every one of them was a humiliation to a man who had spent his life not requiring anything of anybody. He could not rise alone in December. He could not take the stairs until January. He was reduced, in the 2nd week, to being fed broth, and he was so ashamed of it that he turned his face to the wall, and Verity sat down on the edge of the bed with the bowl in her lap and said, "Corwin, look at me. There is no one here but us. I have seen your blood on the library floor. There is nothing left for you to hide." He looked at her. "That is what it is for," she said. "Marriage. Not the settlement, and not the Heir, and not the £30,000. It is so that there is one person in the world who has seen the worst of you and stayed in the room. Now open your mouth and eat the broth." He ate the broth. And in the eating of it, over that long grey winter, something happened to the Duke of Larkmore that he could not have explained to a single man at his club. He fell in love with his wife. Not gratefully, that would have been easy, and she would have hated it. He fell in love with her the way one falls in love with weather, helplessly and in stages, and about small things. He fell in love with the way she read aloud in the evenings and did all the voices badly. With the way she came in from the village with her boots ruined and her cheeks red, and a full account of who had a cough and whose roof leaked and whose son had gone for a soldier, and how she knew every name. With the way she bullied Folds by letter, and bullied the vicar in person, and once bullied the Bishop of Ardleigh across a dinner table on the subject of a lying in charity, until that gentleman capitulated and subscribed 40 guineas, with the ink on her finger. With the fact that she still, on Tuesdays, walked down to the shop and served behind the counter, because she said the boy could not weigh a grain of anything without cheating somebody, and because a duchess who could not weigh out a fever powder was no earthly use to anyone. His mother's sister, Lady Crail, came in February to inspect her, and stayed 3 days and said at last over the teacups, in the voice of a woman making a great concession, "She is very clean and very brisk, and she is not a Lady Corwin, and she never will be." No, Corwin agreed. You could have had Harriet Fenwick and £30,000. I could have had Harriet Fenwick, said the Duke of Larkmore, and a headstone. He put down his cup. There is a piece of my coat in a saucer in the library, aunt. It has been in my body since Valmont, and it was killing me by inches, and every physician in London told me I had a wasting of the blood and sent in his bill. My wife found it across a shop counter in 11 minutes, because she had the manners to touch my wrist. You will speak of her in this house as you would speak of the woman who saved my life, because that is her name, and if that is inconvenient to you, the road to Bath is very good at this season. Lady Crail left the next morning. She wrote 6 months later to ask for a receipt for the Duchess's cough syrup, which Verity sent by return with a note, without one word of triumph in it, and Corwin, reading it over her shoulder, thought that he had never in his life been so proud of anybody. In March, on the anniversary of the day the night sweats had begun, he walked with her to the top of Larkmore Rise. It was 4 miles. He had not walked 4 miles in 3 years. He had to stop twice, and the second time he sat down on a stone wall in the wind and put his head back and laughed out loud at the sheer ordinary blue of the sky, and Verity stood in front of him with her bonnet strings whipping and said, "What in heaven's name is funny?" "Nothing," he said. "I am alive. Nothing is funny. Everything is." She smiled, and then the smile faltered, and she looked away out over the valley, and he saw with a jolt that she had gone white. "Verity? It is nothing. That is my line," he said, "and you never once let me use it." She was silent so long that a lark got up out of the grass and went singing away over the field before she answered. "You are well," she said at last. "You are truly well. Folds says the wound is sound and there will be no return of it, and you will live to be 80 and be a very great nuisance to everybody." She still did not look at him, "and that means, Corwin, that you are no longer a dying man who needed a nurse in a hurry. You are the Duke of Larkmore, 35 years old, with 40 years before you and no hair, and a wife you married across an apothecary's counter in 11 minutes because you thought you had 6 months. The wind went over the rise. Sir Marcus Trelawney, she said very quietly, was wrong about the wasting, but he was quite right that you need a son. And I have thought a great deal these last weeks, that there is a thing called an annulment, and that it is not so very difficult when a marriage has been," her voice went, and she mended it, "when a marriage has been what ours has been. And that you might yet have Harriet Fenwick and £30,000 and a boy with your name, and nobody in England would think one word the worse of you." Corwin Ashby stood up off the wall. "Say that again," he said, "and look at me while you say it." She turned. She was crying and doing it as she did everything else, without any fuss and without any hiding. "I am giving you back your life," she said. "The whole of it. Not the 6 months. All of it. That was the bargain. You asked for an heir and I would not give you one, and I gave you this instead, and I would do it again 100 times, and I want nothing for it. I have never wanted anything for it." Her chin came up in that way he knew. "So take it. Take it and be happy, and let me go back to the shop." The Duke of Larkmore looked at his wife standing on the open hill in the March wind, offering to hand him back a future she had personally, single-handedly, obstinately dragged him out of the grave to have, and he found that he could not speak for a moment. "You are the most infuriating woman in England. Corwin, be quiet. It is my turn." He came and stood in front of her close, and took her hands, which were red and rough and stained at the fingers and were, in his considered opinion, the finest hands in the kingdom. You told me, on the night of our wedding, with my blood on the library floor, that marriage was so that there should be one person in the world who had seen the worst of you and stayed in the room. Do you remember that? That was for you. You were ashamed. It was for me, he agreed. And it is for you now, Verity. Look at me and listen, 'cause I am only going to say this once, and then I intend never to discuss it again for 40 years. He drew a breath. In March of last year I was told I had 6 months. I made my will, I put my papers in order. I sat in that house every evening at 6 o'clock while the fever came up in me like the tide, and I waited to die, and I was not afraid of it. And do you know what that means? It means I had nothing. A man who is not afraid to die has nothing he cannot bear to leave. Her hands had gone still in his. I am afraid now, he said. I am so afraid now that it wakes me at 4 in the morning. Because there is a woman asleep in the next room who does the voices badly and bullies bishops and cannot be made to stop weighing out fever powders on a Tuesday, and if anything took her from me I should not survive it. And that, madam, is the difference between being alive and merely not being dead, and you gave it to me, you cross-accounter, in 11 minutes. Corwin, I do not want Harriet Fenwick. I do not want £30,000. I have 140,000, and it has never once made me warm at night. And as for an Heir, his voice roughened, if there is never a son, then let the estate go the fool, and I shall spend the next 30 years settling every farm on the family that works it, and every cottage on the widow that lives in it. And let him inherit a coronet and a park and be welcome to it. There will be no annulment. There will be no going back to the shop except on Tuesdays, because heaven knows the boy cannot weigh a grain of anything. She made a sound that was half a laugh and half something else entirely. I married you, said the Duke of Lockmore, because I was dying. I am going to stay married to you because I am not. And if you imagine, Verity Ashby, that I have any intention whatever of living the next 40 years without you in them, then for a clever woman you are a perfect fool. And on the top of Lockmore Rise, in the wind, in full view of a shepherd, 2 dogs, and 11 indifferent sheep, he kissed his wife properly for the first time, not as a dying man, not as a bargain, not as a patient. Simply as a man of 35 who had gone rather badly and completely in love, and she took hold of the front of his coat with both hands as though the hill had tilted, and did not let go for a long while. The shepherd, who was 90 and had known the family since the 4th Duke, told the story in the Aller House that night, and nobody in Lockmore village was in the least surprised. They kept the peace of the green coat. It stayed in its saucer in the library all that year, and Corwin's steward wished to throw it away, and Verity would not have it. So the Duke had a small case made of walnut and glass, and he set the thing in it on the mantel of the small library where the deal table had stood, and beneath it he had a brass plate engraved, and the plate said, "Taken out of the 6th Duchy of Lockmore, the 19th of November, by the hand of his wife." That was all. No date of battle, no surgeon's name, no title. Folds, who came down twice a year afterwards to dine and to argue, said it was the most improper monument in England, and that he could not look at it without laughing. He always looked at it. Sir Marcus Trelawney, first physician of England, wrote in the spring to inquire, with delicacy, after his Grace's health, the letter being, in fact, an early attempt to secure a place at the funeral. The Duke of Lockmore replied in his own hand, and his wife found the copy of it in his blotter 3 days later, and read it aloud to him across the breakfast table with her eyebrows climbing steadily towards her hair. "Sir, I am obliged for your inquiry. I am entirely well." The wasting of the blood proved, on examination, to be 3 inches of the facing of my coat, which had been in me since Valamonte, and which was removed in November by a surgeon from Edinburgh at the direction of my wife, who keeps an apothecary's shop in this village and had the singular good manners, before pronouncing upon my case, to lay 2 fingers on my wrist. "I enclose no fee. I remain, sir, your obedient servant, Lockmore." She put the paper down and put her hand over her mouth. "That is unkind," she said. "It is entirely accurate. It is unkind and accurate, which is the worst of all things to be, and you are not to send it." He had already sent it. The 41 families were not turned off. The roofs were mended, and the drainage cut on the low fields, and the school built at the crossroads. and in the second year the Duchess of Larkmoor's dispensary opened in the village, which was 3 rooms and a good stove and a Scottish surgeon in residence, and which had, by the end of that year, taken in 111 people who would otherwise have died in the parish for want of 11 minutes of somebody's attention. She still walked down on Tuesdays. She walked down in a good gown now, and the boy still could not weigh a grain of anything, and the village called her Duchess to her face and Miss Verity behind her back, and she pretended not to know it, and she knew it perfectly well. And on a night the following winter, a wild night, with the rain coming off the eaves as it had done on the day he first laid a sovereign on her counter, Corwin came into the small library and found his wife's the mantel with her hand resting on the walnut case, and her face was strange. "You are ill," he said instantly. He had never lost that. He never would. "Node." She turned round. She was, he saw with astonishment, blushing, she who had not blushed at the word marry, nor at the sight of his blood, nor at the Bishop of Ardley. "No, I am not ill." "Then what?" "Sit down, your grace," said the Duchess of Larkmoor, in the exact voice she had used across an apothecary's counter, "before you fall down." He did not sit down. He looked at her and then at her hand, which had come to rest, without her noticing it at all, low against the front of her gown. And the Duke of Larkmoor, who had been given 6 months to live, and had been given instead a whole life, by a woman who had wanted nothing from him but that he should have it, put his hand over his eyes and stood quite still in the middle of his own library. "Corwin," she said, half laughing, half frightened. "Corwin, say something." He crossed the room and took her face in both his hands. "I asked you once," he said unsteadily, for an Heir. "You did, across a counter, like a man ordering a horse, and you said no." "I said no," she agreed. "I said I would not give you a son to be born fatherless." Her hands came up and covered his. "That is still true. I never will. But a son with a father, a great obstinate stubborn nuisance of a father, who will live to be 80 and walk him up Larkmoor Rise and stop twice on the way, and be laughed at, and not care." Her voice failed her at last, and she pressed her forehead to his. "That I will give you gladly. That I have been waiting to give you." Outside, the rain went on the window, on the mantel in its little case of walnut and glass. The small dead scrap of a green coat sat where it had sat for a year, harmless now, and beneath it the brass plate caught the firelight, and the Duke of Larkmoor, who had once believed himself to be a man with nothing that he could not bear to leave, held his wife in the warm room and discovered that he had, in the end, been given the one thing he had never thought to ask for, and had never deserved, and would spend the whole of his long, unlikely, borrowed life trying to be worthy of. "Then I shall have to live a very long time," he said into her hair, "and be very good and do exactly as I am told." "You will do exactly as you are told," said his wife, "and be nothing of the kind." She was right. She generally was. And 43 years later, when the 7th Duke of Larkmoor stood in that same library to receive the tenants on the day of his father's funeral, he found upon the mantel a small walnut case with a brass plate, and a paper folded beneath it in an old man's shaking hand, which said only, "She gave me all of it. Every day was hers. Be kind to the village and mind the shop, and never let a physician tell you what a woman with 2 fingers on your wrist can tell you better."